Well, hey there, everybody. This is Mr. Lamond, APUSH History, and we're going to review for our test on Unit 12, World War II, specifically going over 12.2, could the United States have avoided entering World War II, which obviously we could not. The key here to remember that the United States, led by President Harding and a coalition of people after World War I, had decisively chosen isolation, return to normalcy, Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawing war, the Nye Committee, which basically said that a bunch of robber barons got rich putting us in World War I so they could sell guns and bullets to the government, etc. So America had chosen a side, and that side was isolation, neutrality. However, as happens with most things, it was hard for us to stay on the sidelines. We didn't get into the war with soldiers very early, but we were definitely choosing a side, and that's what we're going to talk about here first. Again, remember the Nye Committee was a Senate committee that basically focused on how America was allowing certain aspects of our business and industry to drive us into war. We had SOS committees. Charles Lindbergh, John F. Kennedy Sr. were two famous Americans who pushed for isolation. Lindbergh was actually cozying up to Hitler at one point, in an irony. FDR, in 1937, gave what was referred to as the quarantine speech. And basically we said, Japan, you're very naughty and we're going to quarantine you. We only quarantine somebody who's got a disease. And the Japanese recognized that, and they realized that we weren't seeing them as a good guy. So here we are choosing a side. But the Japanese had begun expanding, and we didn't know what else to do. We couldn't go to war. That's illegal. So we just turned off the oil supply to them. And Japan, being an island nation, they were in much need of raw materials. So we'll see how that has an effect later. Congress got involved and at one point passed something called the Neutrality Acts, in which they made it illegal for the United States to choose a side. You could see here Congress and FDR in a debate over how to be involved while Europe is on fire. This was their fireside chat. FDR knew, however, that just wasn't going to cut it. Hitler was bad, the British were good, and so he began to instigate a policy called cash and carry, which basically says if you have cash and you can carry the supplies, we'll sell it to anybody. Well, the Germans were really good with U-boats, not so much with the other stuff. And so because Britannia ruled the waves, we were able to sell and they were able to carry. And so even though we're officially neutral, Dr. Seuss again, the British were able to take our stuff and carry it off to Europe. What you should notice first about the Selective Service Act, more than anything else, is the year. We had a peacetime draft. We started drafting people into the Army before we were even officially at war. That was FDR, again, realizing that our isolation had put us in a precarious situation and we needed to move forward fast. Another example of us choosing a side, at one point FDR gives what he refers to as his For Freedom speech. The freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, the freedom from fear. All of these, of course, point to their opposites, which was basically Germany, which did not have free speech, did not have free worship, which was putting people in the world in fear and putting people around the world in want. So FDR was drawing a line saying who the bad guys were. Hint, it's not Britain. Unfortunately, the British were running out of money, which meant they could not continue with cash and carry. So FDR, in his homespun way, said, well, we'll just lend them the stuff. We'll lend them some tanks and some bullets and some airplanes, and they'll just pay us back when they can. Which, of course, is basically a way of showing Hitler that we're pro-British, as Hitler recognizes here, telling Uncle Sam, you're playing with dynamite. You could see all of the products flowing out of the United States to help these allied war nations. And we're throwing this Lend-Lease pitch to the British Isles, hopefully to keep Hitler from invading. Spikes up. With all that being said, it didn't take long for us to officially enter the war. We knew that Japan was more than frustrated with us. We saw that war was coming, and as this headline says, Japan may strike over the weekend, November 30th, 1941. Admiral Yamamoto had a plan. The ambassadors snuck in and basically said, "Nah, we'd never fight you guys," and then went home and burned all the secret documents, which led to Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, Japanese surprise attack, which partly because our battleships were lined up like ducks on a pond, you can see here, or even worse right here, Japanese spies had given them plenty of good pictures, and it did not take much to put our Pacific Fleet out of action. As a matter of fact, only the fate that allowed our aircraft carriers to not be at Pearl Harbor probably kept us from, if not losing the war from being extended from anywhere from 5 to 10 more years. But Pearl Harbor was a date which will live in infamy. And as great a shot as that was, it made us mad. And so then we declared war. We declared war in a hurry. It was all about avenging Pearl Harbor. We're going to do what it takes. Well, if we declare war on Japan, and Japan has decided to make nice and be buddies with Hitler, well, I guess we're going to war with Germany as well. And so with that speaking, we're in the war. Now, there was a very interesting question. Who do we fight first? Do we fight the Japanese, who we definitely wanted to fight first? You could see that they're seen as this sneaky Jap treachery while showing peace. Don't want to think about what's happening with this poor woman here. Even the song that we listen to, we're going to have to slap the dirty little Jap. We wanted to fight Japan first. On the same token, though, Britain is hanging on by a toenail. The British Bulldog is just about out of action. And in 42, Hitler decided to cast aside the non-aggression pact, and he has put the blitzkrieg on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is not faring so well. And so at the moment, it looks like Hitler is about to destroy not just Europe, but the Soviet Union. So we have a hard choice to make, and FDR has to say, do we go with the emotional, fight Japan first, or do we go with the more practical, fight Europe first? And we decided to fight in Europe first. We didn't have much of a fleet to fight with in the Pacific anyway, and so we decided to turn our attention to Europe, but even then, we weren't able to really get into Europe because Fortress Europa was protected by Hitler and his stormtroopers. So instead, we put Operation Torch into effect and invaded North Africa, knowing that as we went across North Africa, we'd be able to go up into the soft underbelly of Italy to continue the attack. In the meantime, things got bad in the Pacific, especially for the troops on the Philippines. MacArthur, the commanding general in the Pacific, had left a contingent of Marines and Army soldiers in the Philippines with the promise that he would return. It didn't go well for those troops. They were killed in battle, they were starved to death, and those that surrendered went through the Bataan Death March, which was as bad as it sounds. And the Japanese began to show that surrender was not a very noble concept in their eyes, and they were not going to treat American prisoners of war very well. More on that later. That concludes Test Review 12.2. Get busy.